What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Logos Podcast. This is Max.
This is Joey.
And on today's episode, we have a special guest with us, Dr. Eric Graff. How are you, Doctor?
I'm fine, thanks.
Yeah, so this is the second time we've actually had Dr. Graff on this platform. The first time, however, we didn't have video.
What did we talk about? No, we did. It was one of our first video sessions.
Oh, was it really? Okay, yeah. So Galileo, that's right. We were in the trial period.
We were sitting down.
The Inquisition.
Around the table, yeah.
That's right.
Galileo and the Inquisition.
The Inquisition.
That was good. So go back and check that episode out.
Right.
It was a good one.
Yeah.
But Dr. Graff is back. Doctor, could you remind our listeners a little bit about yourself? Who are you?
Well, my name is Dr. Graff, as you said. I'm here at the seminary just over 13 years now. By training, I'm a medievalist, so my specialty is in medieval manuscripts.
So you know how to fight with cool swords and catapult
not exactly.
people?
I'm not a LARPer. If
No
that's,
LARPer.
If that's what you're talking about.
Okay, yeah.
But the idea of working with historical documents means that I teach church history and history here in the seminary. So I'm delighted to do that. And delighted that both times you've asked me to come on, it's for a non-medieval topic.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
But I'll do my best
you
with whatever I can.
Yeah, so today, actually, because of your expertise in history, although it's not necessarily medieval, we're going to be talking about the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And, well, because, you know, I mean, Joey, I don't know about you, right? But
how many times a day, Max, do you think about the
not
Roman
very
Empire?
much, just about 3 or 4 times an hour. And about that, but other than that, not too much. But it is a trend, right? We hear on TikTok or whatever, like people are talking about the Roman Empire, how often they're thinking about it. And then we'll listen to Joe Rogan and he'll bring on, what's his name?
Ryan
Holiday to talk about Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics. And there's just kind of romantic aura around the Roman Empire and the Roman style of living. So we have Dr. Graff.
So we naturally were like, we should talk about the Roman Empire.
Yes.
We don't know that much about the Roman Empire.
No, we don't.
Let's get everything we know. We learned from this guy. So let's.
Hello, guy.
So let's bring him on and have him share some of his knowledge with us. So.
Well, I'm not nearly as young as you are, but I think about the Roman Empire all the time.
Do you?
Well,
you have
given
to.
that I have to teach it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it never surprises me, and it wouldn't surprise my wife to learn that either. But I mean, it's. I'm just going to comment briefly on the way you kind of set it up, that there's a romance or romantic idea about it. I'm not sure if it's a romantic idea, though. Yeah. Like in the space of what social media is doing with it.
Yeah.
Is it a romantic idea, or is it one that kind of escapes that somehow? I think that's part of what people are trying to find out.
That's a good question.
But it's definitely present, and it seems to be with young men in particular. Mm-hmm. They're drawn to the idea of the Roman Empire, the Roman civilization, and might even have a longing to live in a society like that, or to replicate some of the aspects of Roman culture in our world now. So that's what we kind of wanted to dig into today.
That's right. I did want to ask you a question. So initially, full disclosure here, we had considered bringing Dr. Graff on to talk about a new movie.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We got
by Ridley Scott. And so when we first reached out to him, and it's sort of apology to you, Doctor, because we kind of sprung in this conversation later in our time period. However, we did take the time, at least myself, and I think Dr. Graff, I don't think Joey got to, but we took the time to go see the new Napoleon movie, Napoleon Bonaparte, or I think it's just called Napoleon, by Ridley Scott. And I just wanted to get your initial impressions, partly because I think you've drawn out some connections between this historical figure, Napoleon, and maybe some Roman Empire or the Roman society generally. And
we changed the topic, in a certain way, but I said to Max already that this is one of those things where Napoleon is an example of a young man who clearly grew up thinking all the time about the Roman Empire. Yeah. And even as he ascends to heights of power that no one had seen in centuries, the vocabulary of what he's doing, the whole conception of the way they're dealing with France as a state after the revolution, it's all baked in the language of the Roman Empire. He becomes a consul. He becomes first consul. And if you know anything about the history of Rome, someone calling himself first consul has ambitions to become an emperor.
Right.
And so the whole thing kind of plays itself out. So I even said to Max that if you take French history from the beginning of the Revolution, 1789, through to about 1815, the end of Napoleon's career, in that sense, it's almost like a reprise of the entire history of Rome
in
a compacted period of time, because you move from a monarchy, which gives way to a republic, a period of republican government, which eventually descends into chaos and is settled, if you will, in an empire.
And a big empire.
A big empire. So Napoleon has this vision of he's kind of a Julius Caesar of a sorts.
Yeah, and the
kinda
movie
come-
makes that very clear,
Exactly.
that people think of him as a Caesar. He clearly thinks of himself in a way as a kind of Caesar.
But tell us your initial impressions of the movie. So you went to go see the movie, and you saw some connections here between the Roman Empire and Napoleon. But like, be honest, what did you think about it?
I didn't like it, and we talked about this a little bit the other day, but I expected to like it a lot. And when it came to, I didn't find that the movie fulfilled the expectations I had of Ridley Scott as a wonderful filmmaker. Sir Ridley Scott, who has this long history of very fine movies. Gladiator is still one that it's kind of one you can depend on students having seen when they come in. Alien, his whole list of things. But his ideas here, I don't think amounted to what I expected from a movie about Napoleon. Sure. The movie, to me, maybe should have better been described as Napoleon and Josephine. It did focus on their relationship over time, and it kind of skipped through time in a sort of in a way that I thought was trying to do too much without giving a concentrated coherence to it. But everything was geared toward his relationship with Josephine here in a way that I don't know paid off in showing the historical events. So there are, I think, 6 battles in the movie, but really all of them are just filler between episodes with Josephine in the movie. And I think that could be fine for a different type of movie, but I don't know that he ever decided whether it was the historical epic or whether it was the story of the relationship.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and
it fell between.
And I think that's the criticism I've heard at first. We're like, well, they're not historically accurate, right? And then I watched interviews with Ridley Scott saying, well, I wasn't trying to do a historical accuracy. I was trying to do a character development type of movie. But the sense that I got from you, and I think I agree with, is he did neither the historical accuracy or the character development, whereas a figure like Napoleon, you have a lot to work with. And I don't think he fulfilled any
and a lot of
those.
unique characteristics. And
Sure.
I don't think in the movie you ever got to what was really unique. In the movie you see people talking about him as a Caesar or talking about him as, the most powerful man in the history of Europe, perhaps at that point. But you don't see the extraordinary characteristics. He doesn't stick out the way that you might expect that he would have or certainly did in the historical sense. I don't mind that it's not an historically accurate movie per se. It did bother me that they had him shoot, at the tops of the pyramids, which is, I don't know why they would go to that extent when we know that his troops are responsible for shooting at the Sphinx. That could have been just as easy a scene and it would have been accurate. But the idea of picking Napoleon as your subject means that you should be centered on something unique. I mean, he's not an ordinary character. And I don't know that the movie ever decided what was extraordinary about him.
Yeah. I mean, he's referred to all the time, just in different popular literature. Napoleon has some sort of kind of, again, it has this kind of romantic aura around him. I mean, even Friedrich Nietzsche. We recently did an episode on Friedrich Nietzsche, and of all the people in history, he says Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the few that actually embody the Übermensch idea.
Yeah,
I mean,
the will to do what he did,
Will to
right,
power,
is
yeah.
certainly part of his makeup.
Sure.
And that's one of the things that made him extraordinary. The fact that he rose from, being a kid in Corsica, not even properly French,
Correct.
according to the French, to the heights of power that he did is really an extraordinary thing. That alone would have made him unique.
And given the fact that he was only like 5 feet tall.
That's right. Well, he's not that short, even in real life. But the idea, there were things about him that were clearly unusual and noted that didn't show up in the movie. He was noted for never spending a long time, for instance, while eating.
Yeah, I remember you talking about
or
it.
sitting down, for that matter.
And avoiding sitting down. And that isn't shown in the movie. He's shown often eating and taking his time about it, and they even make a point of it in the movie. We now know that that's probably connected to a stomach cancer that he had later in life.
Oh, wow.
But even so, even if it's not accurate, there's something about, usually before that was connected to an illness, people connected it to his drive, that he never spent more than 12 minutes eating, that he was always about efficiency and logistics and
Is it
moving
true
forward.
that he was one of those people who, I've heard, like St. Thomas Aquinas and Napoleon were two of the people who could dictate to multiple scribes at once?
I have never heard the two of them put together
Side by side.
ever,
Yeah.
in fact. So I'd
Well
be
done,
curious
Joey.
to see that reference. But
That's what I've heard.
I have heard that about Aquinas.
Okay.
It doesn't surprise me that Napoleon would be able to handle multiple pieces of business,
Yeah.
perhaps dictating different letters and just receiving these things. And that's normally how a ruler would have done it.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be handwriting your own letters. You'd be dictating.
Right.
You'd have people to do that for you. And handling multiple pieces of business was clearly in his wheelhouse.
That makes sense.
And as a young man, he had ambitions for, first of all, for a revolution of France.
Yeah.
Right. And then there was always a kind of revolutionary drive in him. I mean, actually, the opening scene of the movie Napoleon, for example, shares a letter that he wrote to his brother, kind of thanking him and inspiring his brother, telling him, hey, look, this is what we're going to do next. We're going to go into this battle. And then Napoleon wins that battle, and then you got to kind of get the broad entrance of who this man Napoleon really is, which is kind of a military genius. And I do think the movie positively maybe portrayed that to me in a way that I didn't know his kind of military genius. It just shows my ignorance, for one, but also shows the fact that I think there is a sense of you get that he's really trying to establish himself. And I think it's almost like a cartoonish feel I had throughout the movie of Napoleon. It's like they had little scenes of trying to make him look like an idiot, to be honest with you. Whereas I think there's some level of genuine genius in the movie that should have been drawn out. That's one of my criticisms.
Yeah, he goes to pains, I think, Ridley Scott does, to show his foibles, to show him being a bit uncouth or not exactly polished enough for certain situations. They make reference several times in the movie to him not having proper manners.
Right.
And especially it's one of the lines given to the British commander, Wellington, at the end.
Yeah.
That's a very British thing to damn someone,
criticize.
on the subject of manners after he's just caused, continent-wide warfare.
It was just like it's a shame that such a great man has such terrible manners or something like that.
Yeah, that's given to Wellington,
right? Exactly.
Who says it in a very snotty way.
Yeah.
But that's also a British stereotype, and there's probably some element of play in that.
Sure.
With the script, but the idea that Napoleon had that ambition and had that unique contribution, like I said, I think it doesn't quite connect. And what I saw that kind of bothered me about the movie is a lot of modern preconceptions or preoccupations, rather, with relationships that found their way into this movie and dominated the movie, rather than having the movie present something not foreign, but something extraordinary out of history to the modern viewer. I felt like the movie showed the modern viewer his own perspective dressed up in historical.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Me too.
Doctor, you mentioned that, interestingly enough, you think that the events that transpired throughout the life of Napoleon are almost a replica of what happened in the Roman Empire. Kind of transitioning back to our original topic of this Roman Empire that we want to dive into. Could you walk us through what kind of those events were? You mentioned the transition from monarchy to chaotic republic to empire. For our listeners who maybe took Western Civ at one point but have gotten kind of foggy, or your co-hosts who have
not me. I know
been
it
a
all.
couple of years out.
That's right. Now I'm fresh, Doctor.
You got to walk us through a brief overview.
I have a quiz for you after. So if you'd like to take it.
To be fair, I didn't take Western Civ with you.
Well,
which just means that I don't know Western Civ
probably
history.
So he's taught me twice.
Well, yeah. So the basic pattern in Roman history, and when you teach Roman history, the early period of Roman history, about which we don't know that much, but it began as a monarchy, from Romulus, the founder of Rome, down. And then in about the year 509, you have a revolution, essentially, where they throw out the king. And it's around an episode called the Rape of Lucretia. So when the king begins to presume, it's the king's son, in fact, who presumes that he can sort of have his way with someone else's wife without, being penalized for it, some of the nobles gather together in order to turf out the king. And famously, that involves one of the early members of the Brutus family. And they send a king packing, and they establish a republic afterward. The republic lasts through the period of the rise of Rome, really, from about 508, 509, all the way up until the 1st century BC and the career of Julius Caesar. And so Julius Caesar comes to the fore as a very, he is very like Napoleon. I mean, there's a great analogy here. He's almost universally capable as someone who, even if he holds a minor office that has nothing to do with warfare, he tends to improve that office. We talk in the class about changing the calendar, for instance, things like that. Well, Caesar's ambitions become known, and then he's torn down by the conspiracy because everyone fears he wants to take the Republic back to be a king, to be a royal foundation. And to avoid another king, it's another Brutus, famously, Cassius and some of the other conspirators who assassinate Caesar in the Senate.
Which you can read about in Shakespeare's work, Julius Caesar.
Yeah, Shakespeare. My daughter's reading that now in high school, so
very good.
she's going through it. And so you then move into a civil war period. Eventually, the civil war and the chaos is resolved when Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, establishes full control. And eventually, although he himself will take a long time before he uses this title, he'll eventually be recognized as an emperor. And so the end of the Republic then ends up in an empire established, which then takes Rome to the end of her founding, which in the West is 476, but it lasts in Constantinople right up until 1453.
My goodness.
So you've got from about 752 is the founding of Rome to 1453, if you follow out the royal line,
Sure.
to the end of Constantinople.
So I just stepping aside from like the historical facts here, like we obviously, as we said at the beginning, kind of motivated by what we see a trend in social media talking about the Roman Empire. Like, why do we think given these historical facts, people are fascinated with such a thing? Like, why do we think that people are making these videos of like, how often do you think about it? A lot, actually. You because you're a history professor, us because we're men. But just like why? Yeah.
Well, it interests me that it's showing up in social media. I mean, it's been an analogy in history for a while. One of the things that I always point out, even when teaching the Greek period, is George Marshall, in the period after World War II, very clearly made the analogy in the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, between communism and the West. Those are historical analogies that have always operated.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And even the American Republic, which in our architecture, in our structure, in our founding, takes a lot from Roman governance.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
And historians have had this analogy in mind. How long can a republic last? That's one of the questions that even Ben Franklin's asking.
Mm-hmm.
You have a republic if you can keep it.
De Tocqueville asks a similar question when he comes to America.
Yeah, so how long can this experiment go? So that's been in the intellectual conversation and political theory conversation for a long, long time. I'm fascinated to see it show up on TikTok. Not that I see it directly on TikTok, but I see it, filtered through other things. And I'm as curious as you are as to exactly what it means, because when a young man thinks of Rome, right, he could be thinking about anything. I mean, the varied history means you could be thinking about decline and worried about decline of institutions and solidity. You could be thinking about glory.
Mm-hmm.
You could be thinking about conquest. You could be thinking about, Christian Rome or pre-Christian Rome.
Yeah.
Pagan traditions.
You might be fearful of
living. Yeah.
You might be fearful of persecution. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that one could be thinking about Rome.
Yeah, that's true. Super broad.
So it's a very big field, and I'd be curious to kind of get a reading on, is there a typical brand of thinking about Rome? You mentioned the Joe Rogan interviews, which I haven't seen.
Yeah.
But if that's a Stoic perspective, I assume that they're kind of recommending a Stoic perspective in modern society.
Yeah, well, part of it, I think, to me, the motivation is a disciplined living is one aspect of it. Kind of a reclamation of the paternal institution.
Mm-hmm. And is that sort of despite difficulties in the real world, but is it in a context of assuming a surrounding decadence or a surrounding decline?
I think it has to do with recognizing that there are a surrounding decline, right? So no many other things are stable, right? We see all these kind of progressive movements around. The Roman Empire must be the way that we move back into something stable, something strong, and something hopeful. That's what it seems to me.
Yeah, and my hypothesis, and you can, chime in on this, Doctor, but we live in a time right now where it seems to be that, from what I can gather, the Roman Empire is associated somehow with masculinity.
Right.
And it's young men who are drawn to the idea of the Roman Empire because I think, there's all these people talking right now about a crisis of masculinity, but I think maybe they look at the Roman Empire and they see such a clear social structure. It is paternalistic, but there's clearly defined roles for men. And that's something that we don't really have now in the chaos ever since the sexual revolution. It's like we've been trying to equalize everything, blot out all distinctions between men and women. I think men probably are feeling like, what is my place? What does it mean to be a man? And then they look and they see the society, or they hear about examples of impressive men from this society, and they think, that's attractive. Yeah. So that's kind of the idea I have.
No, I think that's a really interesting idea. The idea of looking for a distinction or a distinct set of markers or characteristics that will allow you to assume a role.
Right.
That is recognized. So one of the things about Marcus Aurelius, if he's the, kind of the source of Stoicism, he's a very good source of Stoicism. Mm-hmm. But historically, he's right on the cusp of the changeover. And if you want to talk about competing masculinities, let's say, the changeover between the good emperors in the period of Marcus Aurelius, and pretty soon thereafter you have the first invasions of barbarian peoples. So you move from the model of an ordered Rome, maybe in decline, but still with these definitions. You can be a paterfamilias, right? And then you move into a situation where the other form of masculinity is a kind of raiding barbarian form of masculinity. It's a sort of considered lawless. It sort of intrudes upon the ordered space, and you see Rome struggling, not just to keep people out exactly, but struggling to manage all of its borders in that way, and suffering from some internal decline as well.
Yeah, you mentioned the paterfamilias. Could you talk about what that is?
Yeah. So as a term, it's not an easy one to drop in, but it really just means father of the family in a sense.
Okay.
A man in Roman society with some standing, if he was a member of a certain class, the upper classes of society, would be not only the head of his immediate family and household, but also he would be responsible all the way down from his own family, his wife and children, perhaps even brothers and parents, but also all the client families that were part of his farm or properties, and all the slaves of all his own slaves, his own client. But he had legal responsibility for everyone up and down the line. And in Roman society, that's how you accrued power, because your vote, for instance, would count for more if you had more clients, more slaves, more population, a bigger group, etc. But the idea of the paterfamilias, if anyone knows the word now, they usually know it through the movie "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?"
It's true.
George Clooney's character keeps using that phrase, I'm the paterfamilias, I'm the paterfamilias, which is a kind of mockery or takeoff on that. But again, it's the role you're talking about. It's that ideal where you are the recognized authority, but who also has this responsibility. And so that image, if you want to say that that's the image of, let's say, in a modern parlance, a patriarchy or paternalistic society, that is clearly one model where you have a clearly defined role, which is valued, which is, has a lot of responsibility with it too. Even thinkers like Jordan Peterson and others who connect with young men today, they frequently talk first and foremost about responsibility. Sure. And the reason that's the case is that responsibility is what gives you an authentic source of power, because you need the power to fulfill the responsibility. Right. But like I said, right on the cusp of the Stoicism is this other model, which is threatening. The idea that this could all collapse and you could fall into chaos again.
Which is what you think is one of the reasons there's such a kind of an attraction to the Roman Empire right now, because there's kind of an intuition of decadence around us. We're like,
that's interesting.
There's something falling apart. There's people at the borders. There's all kinds of things happening. Things are crumbling, and it's like, well, maybe if we go back to the Roman Empire and claim our swords and have our cool helmets and our sweet sandals, then we can reclaim something kind of organic, something natural, something raw back.
Well, yeah, and rather than organic, I think I might say something like authentic, in the sense that it has a recognized spot in society. To be that way is an expected and a recognized responsibility and role. That's not something that young men find easily.
No, right.
Where do I fit? Where am I supposed to fit? It depends on where you go, who you're with. Social conditions are fluid.
Sure.
All kinds of things are much more fluid these
Gender
days.
itself is considered fluid these days.
Right. Yeah. Well, you talk about this lack of distinction. That's clearly been the trend.
Right.
A decades-long trend, at least. But looking for distinction and looking for definition, I think, is part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So we're here talking about the Roman Empire more broadly. What we think some of the motivations behind the trends are. But what are some maybe characteristics that we think are positive from the Roman Empire that we think should be things that we can look back to as helping guide our future in a certain way that you think are worthy of pointing out?
I'm going to start with, I did say this to you before, Max, when we were talking about, I was able to have my children come with us. They came to Europe this summer. We
Sure.
went to Rome for a brief visit. It was their first time there. My daughter looked around really the first day in one of the public spaces in Rome, and she just said, "Why don't we have this?"
Yeah.
And what she meant was the beautiful public space. No, she meant this idea that a public space would be not just surrounded by antiquity, but built with an idea of the public and the beauty surrounding you, and that this is like, it was a really impressive thing to her to see that first and foremost. And I said, partly the answer is the intention. And the intention of Rome was to build for permanence. And I really think that one of the things that people suffer from in finding their role or in finding something that they feel they can contribute to productively is that the goalposts keep changing.
Yeah, constantly.
And Rome had a very stable set of ambitions. Rome had a kind of eternal ambition about its infrastructure, about its architecture, about its art and poetry. Even in the pre-Christian period, it had this idea that it was forever. And so when you stand in a public square in Rome, among buildings that were built in the first century, you're part of the intended audience.
So there was a level of permanence, but also a recognition of the importance of the person. Right?
I think so.
Kind of,
that they made it for you.
Yeah. But they also took pride in their culture as a Roman people.
For sure.
Right.
And that transition, so if you want to say a positive aspect,
Yeah.
I think that ambition itself is positive, to have enough confidence in yourself that you feel like you're doing something worthy of permanence.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal. The other thing is when it transitions from late Rome into kind of the Rome of the popes rather than the Rome of the Caesars, let's say.
Which begins around...
Well, the empire in the West falls in the 5th century.
Sure.
But already from Pope Leo, you see a very explicit growth of the church into some of the administrative roles of the empire in the West.
Gotcha.
But certainly when you think of the architecture of even the 4th century churches, but certainly through the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, the church also fostered the idea of building for permanence. It takes you hundreds of years to build a cathedral. Right.
Yeah.
When you build a cathedral, you're not thinking that you're going to tear this thing down in 30 years, the way that,
Right.
Today if we build a stadium, we may think, the lifespan of this stadium will be 40 years.
Or a Wendy's, or a McDonald's, or any other modern architecture is there for convenience, really.
Yeah, it's a format thing
Stated.
that lasts as long as the franchise lasts, and then it's meant to be replaced.
Sure.
That's a different way of thinking which is a much more common European way, whether it's French or Roman or something like that, to say, no, we're going to build for beauty, which we intend to last.
Yeah.
If future people use it a different way, that's a different thing. But the intention was to build for permanence. And I think that's impressive in a way that does attract people.
Yeah, and I definitely think that's something we could benefit from.
Yeah.
Like our culture could, if we could use to acquire some of that spirit.
But it requires that you have both the technical know-how to do it,
right,
and the will to do it. And one of the things that has come up recently, I don't know if this contributes to people thinking about Rome particularly, but we only recently found the secret of Roman concrete again.
Wow.
Roman concrete has been known to be better than any modern concrete for a long time. And if you go to the Pantheon, which is probably the best example, or if you see any of the aqueducts built in the 1st century, they're still there.
That's wild.
And when the Colosseum is missing stones, it's because people took them away. It's not because it fell down.
That's crazy.
It took them away to build other buildings.
Hey, when we go to Rome, we should take a stone from the Colosseum.
bring it back.
Don't
We can bring it back.
don't do that.
Don't do that? Okay.
I want to say for the podcast, we're not advising our seminarians to steal stones from
That's fine, but
Roman
Joey, do you
monuments.
still want to take
We'll
a
talk
stone?
later.
Okay, we'll talk later.
But the idea is, they've discovered the secret is something like a certain recipe with seawater, volcanic ash, and a certain way of leaving lime blocks in it so that when water seeps into the concrete, it reactivates the chemistry, which reseals the concrete. So we now know exactly why Roman concrete never corrodes, essentially.
Lasts so long.
But it's the 21st century before we've caught up to what they were doing.
Yeah.
So there's the technical side of just admiring what Rome did.
Right.
But then there's also like whether you can have the will to build something for permanence. We have our governmental Capitol buildings, which maybe have that ambition in them. But in the public spaces, we don't often do that. And I think even in our domestic architecture, we don't often do that.
So one positive aspect you think of the Roman society we can carry forth is this idea of permanence, just generally.
Well, I think it's behind the permanence is the confidence to say,
Sure,
this deserves, or this is a good thing, and we will build this way because we think it's best.
It's worth it.
And I think we have a hard time agreeing or asserting what we think is best. It's part of a pluralist society. You don't always agree
right
on these things.
We don't want to impose. We don't want to.
We also don't think something is better. We prefer neutrality or equality is kind of our biggest, our biggest virtue in America, for example, rather than distinction. Distinction is a bad thing, right? We would say in the church, it's like everybody's equal in dignity, but different in ability, right? Different talents bring different things to the table, and those things are important too. This thing we call society.
But in the public spaces, that sometimes leaves us with ugliness.
Yeah, which
it leaves us with the lowest common denominator. So if you're withdrawing from the public space in order not to be too assertive or in order to foster equality or something that can happen is that everything descends to the lowest common denominator, and you get a brutalist architecture, for instance, or an architecture that's purely about cost and not about beauty.
Right, and then the citizens aren't being nourished by beauty like they might be in Rome, for example, right? We've talked about this on our like how much we need beauty and how much we're suffering when it's not present in our lives, and this is all.
And the need to do something that lasts, even in the Napoleonic era, for instance, when they build the Arc de Triomphe, that's built in the Roman style of an arc, right? It's like the Arch of Titus or something that. It's a celebration that is still a central landmark in Paris, despite the fact that they've rejected that period of their own history.
Right.
Famously, they keep it, and that monument stays there because it's meant to be permanent somehow.
Okay, that's a great insight. This something to admire about the Roman civilization. This aspiration for permanence, for beauty, for confidence in the goodness of things that they're pursuing. Anything else? Anything else that in your mind? And I do think, Doctor, when young men are thinking about the Roman Empire today, I don't think they're thinking about like Christian Rome. I think they're thinking about pre-Christian Rome. Do you get that sense too?
I do get that sense, partly because I think they don't recognize that Christianity had a lot to do with the Roman Empire.
Right.
They just think it's this thing that we see on the movie 300, for example.
Yeah.
Right. Or this,
which is Greece, but
but they don't know.
I get your point. Yeah.
People don't know this distinctions. They'll just draw up and chalk up these things as like the Spartans and are the same things as the Romans.
But I do think, it's a good question. And even in Western Civ, as little time as I can spend in Rome, it's usually 4 weeks in Rome, right? There is a question I always ask about Romanitas, which is the Romanness that they talk about in the golden era of Rome. And it's a sort of, which of these were qualities associated with Romanitas? The odd one out, it's all but this one. The odd one out is subtlety.
Okay.
Because the virtues of a Roman man are self-sufficiency, duty and honor. The idea of officium or duty is really important. Capability, certainly. Respect for your place in society. So if you're a soldier, you fit into a system. Roman soldiery is not about Yahoo heroes doing something individual. It's about sacrifice for the republic or sacrifice for the king, duty to your unit. That kind of thing. And the Roman organization fosters these virtues. So Romanitas is about being straightforward, being honest, being tough, disciplined for sure. The famous line is that the Roman army traveled and won with its spades rather than its swords. So when it traveled, it dug new forts every night. They made sure that everything was organized and supported. And I think the yearning for a system that works like that is part of what people look back on in Rome. If they're thinking positively about Rome, they're thinking about the ability of Rome to extend itself really almost limitlessly in the given era, but to do so in ways that were just remarkably effective.
And it just reminds me of something, a dichotomy that I know, again, going back to Friedrich Nietzsche, draws out, but I think you've seen this in other philosophers too, of this idea of the Apollinarian effect and the Dionysian effect. You've heard of these?
Yeah, we talked about it.
So the Apollinarian effect has to do with Apollo, but the effect of Apollo having a connection with Rome as a kind of an ordered way of life, a kind of structured, a sort of glorious living, whereas the Dionysian effect in Nietzsche's mind is this kind of this Greek, this kind of loose, undisciplined, chaotic, promiscuous living. And so he draws these two kind of effects of like, well, you have kind of the Roman, the Apollinarian, and then you have the Greek or the Dionysian, people who just party all the time.
Yeah, so in that sense, Apollo would be more like a representative even of hierarchy.
Exactly,
order.
Systematic
the sun
living.
Image as the top of the hierarchy of the world, essentially. And Dionysius is that subversive chaos.
Yeah, and so he
pleasure seeking and other
exactly.
things.
So there's like, for him, it's like history's the tension between these two kind of personalities constantly fighting with each other.
It's interesting.
And so I wonder if there's some of that even here.
Yeah, I think if you can think of, again, I'm not as familiar with the individual videos in TikTok or something, but if you think of young men perceiving around them a culture, kind of a Dionysian culture.
Yes.
Then looking for, the effect of Apollo in that analogy is an understandable thing.
It's totally understandable. And I think you mentioned Jordan Peterson earlier. One of the things he'll also talk about in addition to responsibility is precisely hierarchy. How like we, in this egalitarian society in which we live, what we're starving for is something that's built into our nature to some extent, which is existence within a hierarchy. And when we don't have that and we can't function within that, then we kind of are lost and disoriented. And so to me, it makes total sense that guys especially look at insofar as they're attracted to a civilization like Rome, are looking at it and seeing hierarchy and thinking, wow, that'd be nice,
Yeah. It's a really interesting thing to watch with young men. My son is a senior in high school.
Okay.
And he's at a boys' school. And I think one of the ways that served him very well is that boys' schools do sort themselves pretty naturally into hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
It happens, as you know, in sports, I'm sure, where you have objective measures. There are times when you realize you may be on the team, but maybe you're not the best one on the team.
It's so true. Yeah.
You're not the old guy.
And you start to realize levels.
Yeah.
And for instance, my son does cross country. Well, cross country is an easy one for a coach. You don't have to pick the varsity runners. The times pick the runners for you.
Right.
And men accept the times.
Sure.
You're either in it or you're outside of it. And you work on what you can work on, but you accept the objective basis for the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
That clarity is really useful. Even if you're on the outside of the top rank, it's very useful because it orders you. It gives you a position from which you can operate.
Yes.
With some confidence and with some self-knowledge. That's been very effective. And I think that's one, it's one way in which I went to a boys' high school too. I think I remember that being, useful for me in that context. I'm not sure. I've never had experience with a girls' high school for my daughter or anything like that. So I'm not sure if that operates the same way for women in single-sex education. But if you're talking about what men might be after when they're imagining Rome or when they're thinking about Rome, if it's a positive thing,
right, which is you mentioned,
it would be that structure that seems to to have achieved so much.
And it's funny as we're talking right now. It comes to mind that the fact that when people think about, for example, the Roman Empire, or just generally, they probably aren't thinking about the character and history that is Roman Empire. They're probably just thinking about like characteristics that they want to assemble or resemble in their own life.
Yeah.
And I think this is how we live generally. A lot of us, at least I guess speaking for myself, but when I hear people talk about certain particular times in history or certain historical figures, they're not so much talking about the historical figure themselves as much as maybe characteristics they want to embody or certain times in history they want to go back to. That helps them be stable, be permanent, confident, and be disciplined, have some sort of systematic living. So I definitely think that those are some positive things from the Roman Empire, but I think it's interesting how most people carry that attitude into things like the Roman Empire.
Well, it's very funny to me when you teach through different periods of history. There are moments when the dominant, let's say, historical image in the era of Romanticism, for instance, is usually a medieval image.
Okay.
When
so
you
this-
look at
yeah.
the Romantic painters, the Neo-Gothic painters or something, they're usually looking back on the era of chivalry or something like that as the model from which they draw certain virtues, let's say, in painting or architecture or something like that. We're in an era now where maybe Rome is a different model. So the question is, in a sense, if you're doing art history, why the different model? What is it about Rome that's different from the Middle Ages? And maybe it is, like you say, that it's a pre-Christian Rome that they're thinking of.
Yeah.
The Middle Ages is not separable in many cases from a Christian society. Certainly chivalry isn't.
Right.
But when it comes to Rome, you do have this space of imagination that's outside of the church,
Yep.
with which not very many young men are familiar, frankly.
Sure.
And so maybe it's an easier point of attachment somehow.
Okay, so let's say there is a guy who is attracted to some of these values, let's hypothetically say they're thinking of pre-Christian Rome, and they're seeing hierarchy, structure, order, the permanence, the confidence, all these things, and they're wanting to embody that, so they start thinking to themselves, man, I wish I lived in the Roman Empire.
I want confidence. I want discipline.
What should
Do
these
you want
guys...
these things? Sign up for the
Sign
Roman
up
Empire.
for 3 payments of $19.99. You can get you a Roman Empire.
Surely, however, not everything was perfect in the Roman Empire, especially before Christianity. So I'm curious about what are some of the downfalls of this civilization, some of the negative aspects of this culture that existed before Christianity, and then where we can eventually go is how did Christianity kind of transform this culture into something more beautiful?
Yeah, well, I would say at the fall of Rome, Christianity probably did a lot more compensating for the weaknesses of Rome at the end, at least immediately speaking. But when you think of some of the negative aspects, they're cotangent, or they coincide very much with the virtues.
Yeah.
So as I say, even in the good emperors with Marcus Aurelius, you're into late Rome and you're about to get into the period of the barbarian invasions, but you're already seeing an elite culture that is decadent, even by Roman standards. So even the writers of Rome themselves, they note the fact that with greater wealth, with greater power, the Senate becomes more decadent. It becomes more involved in politics that in the early phases of Rome would have been considered really distasteful because they're driven by money and power and nepotism and, these kind of illicit means of exerting control.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of decadence and ruin in the late Roman Empire. When the church grows into taking up some of the administrative roles, it also takes on some of that danger for decadence as well. But it has several great examples of people who managed to walk in both worlds. The best example probably in the early history of the Western Church is St. Martin. St. Martin, who was a soldier.
Tours?
Martin of Tours.
That's the one, baby.
Very
Come
good.
on.
You got it in one.
We just celebrated him not too long ago, too.
Well, there's Martin de Tours, and then there's Martin of Tours.
That's right. One tours and one pours things.
Try tour.
Try
Right? Not,
tour.
not tours.
He
There it
he,
is.
well, he tours. Yeah, okay.
Martin of Tours.
But yeah, Martin's Day, this is maybe trivia time or factoid time. Martin's Day is November 11th.
Yes, that's why it's on my mind.
So he's the great
Recent.
soldier saint who becomes then an abbot and a bishop. We celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th
Wow.
because the armistice in World War I was signed on November 11th.
Oh, the
Is
11th.
that because it was his
But it was
feast
signed on November 11th in 1911, or 1914 rather, or 1918?
day? Yeah,
18,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, because it was St. Martin's Day.
Wow.
So they
phenomenal.
hustled to get that deal done on the feast day that was already dedicated to soldiers, so that the settlement of the war could be celebrated on the feast of, or would be marked by the
That's
feast.
for free, guys. Free historical fact there.
So we don't,
no charge.
we call it Veterans Day now, but behind all of that is the placement of the Feast of St. Martin on what we now call Veterans Day.
Okay, and here was a Christian man.
He's a Christian man. He converts to be Christian as a Roman soldier.
Okay.
And then he famously, while a Roman soldier, divides his famous Roman cloak, the capilla, which is the landmark or the hallmark of the Roman soldier, big heavy wool cloak. He cuts it and gives half to a beggar outside the city. And it's that capella, which then eventually becomes a relic, which then is built into the royal chapel for Charlemagne.
That's awesome.
No way. I didn't
And
know
that's
that.
where we get the word chapel from capella.
Oh my gosh.
Right.
I didn't.
So there are lots of these connections here, but Martin is the perfect crossover because he has the Roman soldiery. He is an accomplished soldier.
Probably embodies the best of those Roman virtues that we just spoke about.
Exactly. And then he becomes a convert, leaves the soldiery, becomes an abbot of a monastery, and then is called out of being just an abbot to be a bishop as well. And it's Martin's shrine at Tours, which is probably the wealthiest and most frequent target of pilgrimage in the first several centuries after the fall of Rome.
Wow.
In the West. And so, that becomes the centerpiece of things. It's actually the site, not to go too far into this, but it's the site that is being attacked by the Muslim forces in their furthest advance in the West.
Wow.
When they try to attack Tours,
Wow.
is the first time that the Carolingians are able to stop that advance. Charles Martel
Yeah. Okay. This
defends
is all, yeah.
the city of Tours in 721, and that's the furthest that advance will ever
The
go.
limit. Yeah.
So it's one of those great Roman things that transfers directly into the Christian world is Martin and the cult of Martin too. The memory of that idea that you could be both Roman and Christian is embodied in Martin, I suppose.
So we have as a positive model here Saint Martin, respectively, who embodies, as Joey said, a leader, a proper leader who embodies these positive characteristics which you've laid out earlier in the episode that we can point to as somebody has taken up the Roman way of life and kind of adopting it into a Christian modality.
And that's important because, as you said, we are Roman Catholics, right? We still have this Roman ethos in a lot of the things that we do. But, I'm thinking of a young man maybe who's longing for a Roman civilization in a way that we've talked about, longing for the hierarchy, the order, the discipline, the greatness, the permanence. And, but I think you can go too far in this. And I think I've heard, popular voices do so in this desire to assert kind of a male role, a male position. You can go too far and you kind of fall prey to, one of the downfalls that you mentioned. You become too decadent. You can become too full of yourself. You can think masculinity is about, just being as extravagant or as powerful or as dominant as possible. And this can lead to things that I think were probably present in the Roman Empire, like misogyny, right? The paterfamilias, he could, if I'm not mistaken, couldn't he kill any of his slaves or servants at will?
Not without some consequence.
Correct me. Yeah.
There are some limits on that in Roman society.
Okay.
But it's a role of pretty unquestioned authority. It is ripe for abuse.
And so this figure of Martin, I think, is a great model because he takes what's good in the Roman virtues, but then they're perfected in his Christian faith, right? In his not desire to dominate or to assert himself, but to give, to tear his cloak in half and give it to a poor man. And that's kind of, if any young man is listening to this and there's a takeaway I want him to take from this episode, it's that image of Martin. I think that's beautiful.
Right. Yeah, because there is a sense of which the Christian tradition, right, so we have Jesus Christ as kind of our model, whereas the Roman Empire may have had philosophers, right, Aristotle onward. We actually have...
He was Greek.
Embodied truth. He was Greek, but my point is that it enters into their literature, into their way of thinking, into their style of life. Then we have Marcus Aurelius as examples, but then the church has Jesus Christ as kind of truth itself, truth embodied, that it takes up and sanctifies in a certain way the Roman Empire and carries it forward. And I think it's a good point. We're still Roman. Mm-hmm. We're Roman Catholics is what we say we are. And there's an interesting, as we were preparing for this episode, something that struck me too is I'm doing my research paper on the conversation on the trial of Jesus Christ when he's before Pontius Pilate in the Sanhedrin. And there's this interesting drama between Rome.
Yeah, Rome is present there.
Rome is absolutely present
in a position of judgment.
Exactly.
But it's really ambiguous about it. I mean,
Yeah.
Pilate's character is fantastic.
Yeah.
In not just in history, but in Christian literature.
Right.
There are ways in which he sometimes appears as a very sympathetic figure,
Yeah,
not wanting to pronounce where he doesn't think it's his place to pronounce.
exactly.
But other times he's
Less sympathetic.
cast as a villain. Right?
Exactly. And this one commentator makes this point. It's like you have Pontius Pilate here, kind of being the expression of Rome. In some gospels being portrayed as sympathetic, in other gospels not being so sympathetic, right? And yet here are the Roman authorities now questioning Jesus Christ as the Jews are chanting other things from afar. And there's this kind of deep drama, I think, in this tension between Rome and Christianity that's kind of always existed, and yet now we call ourselves Roman Catholic. I just think it's funny how we've adopted this identity, and yet it's not all perfect, the Roman Empire, I mean.
Yeah, it's a complicated thing. And when you try to explain to someone, especially someone who's young, how is it that the papacy began to rule in Rome?
Yeah.
What happened? Well, the emperor changed the capital, but in a sense bestowed some of those properties and some of the earliest lands for the basilicas and things onto the Pope. And the papacy grows into that authority in the West, where it has to take on both secular and spiritual authority.
Yeah.
Not absolute secular authority in the West, and it usually looks for some sort of temporal partner to do that appropriately. But certainly the presence of the church grows in the absence of the strong imperial force in the West. So being Roman and being Catholic is interesting in that sense, because there's something about that charism from Peter which escapes what was even the Roman structure and yet takes over the identity of Rome. Even today, when you're a tourist in Rome, they talk about, do you want to see the Rome of the Caesars or the Rome of the popes?
Really? That's fascinating.
And there are different tours that will, break up your time in that way.
Not Martin tours.
No, not Martin in that sense.
Martin tours is different.
And you can't be Porres in order to sign up for those tours either. It takes some money. But the Vatican, the Vatican museums, the church, the great churches of Rome, all of those are, if you will, a separable entity from some of the great classical sites. Now, there are sites that are just inextricably blended now. The Pantheon is a good one. Yes. It's a first century building that is now a Christian church. It was originally dedicated to all the gods. Now it's an All Saints church. But the layers of dedication in it are there. And that kind of layering is part of the Roman Catholic blend of identity. What you can make of that in the American world, or even in the modern Western world, is maybe a further complication. But
I did want to mention, I should have mentioned this at the beginning of the episode or early on, but there is a sense of, as Americans, we have a certain relationship to the Roman, maybe political structure more so. And I think you mentioned in our foundation, in our Constitution, obviously, and and it's interesting, I guess, to me, how that's, as Americans, we have a particular view of Rome. We see it as kind of the thing we want to embody, because they had a democracy, so we have a democracy, and so they're kind of the big brother of America. And then how the church then comes to America as, and I don't know, these as I was preparing for this episode, these are the kind of things that were running through my head. It's like, it's just funny how
they're wonderful analogies. They're never exact analogies.
Right. Yeah.
But in the same way, for instance, that the church grew up in the Roman Empire without standing, really, until it made converts and grew up through the ranks of society and over time. The same way in America, Catholics enter the American Republic mostly without standing. Maryland is a slight example in that sense, but Catholics come to America without an expectation that they're going to exert Catholic political control. They're not coming to another Catholic monarchy. They're not they're not going to a Spanish territory that might have that history. It's an explicitly pluralist atmosphere.
And when you read some of the letters of John Carroll, which is the first bishop of the United States in Maryland, you see some of that. He's not trying to be explicitly Catholic, as it were. He's trying to lay out more kind of political principles, political way of life, and trying to bring in human dignity and social Catholic teaching. But it's a complex kind of discussion to have.
It's a really interesting. The text that I'm thinking of right now is an early Christian text. I think I'm thinking of the letter of Diognetus, which is an early text describing what Christians are, and the fact that they're difficult to spot in society. They don't explicitly dress completely separate the way that Jews would, for instance. So they're not as easy to spot as Jews, but they're like Jews, right? They're not. They don't explicitly stand against the culture all the time, but they are separate. They don't challenge the social structure to tear it down, for instance, but they won't respect it when they have their own meals, right? This kind of thing is very strange. And this letter to Diognetus really sets out this strange picture of who are these people who seem to be chameleon-like because they're living their faith according to kind of another worldly ambition and hierarchy, but they're fitted in pretty well so that they're not immediately, identifiable as separate somehow. And I think to some extent that's been a characteristic of Catholicism in America too.
Yeah.
Not always, but the idea that Catholics have to make it here in a pluralistic, pretty secular society, and you grow to be quite an important sector of the population, but by no means with control.
Right.
In that way. And so the definition that you talked about earlier, Joey, I think is not just for young men generally, but for Catholics, you're still looking for that definition.
Yes.
We have a Catholic president, for instance, but it doesn't seem to help us find the definition because that part of his presidency is not really foregrounded.
Explicit, yeah.
Right. And so even to the extent that John F. Kennedy's was.
Right.
But you remember Kennedy was suspected that maybe he would be acting essentially as a foreign agent.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
Because he was Catholic, right?
Yeah.
So some of that suspicion and some of that advantage both still exist in Catholicism here, which is maybe a long way from your initial topic.
No, but I think there's some to
That's
that. Yeah,
fascinating.
The Catholics generally have never been so welcome in any way, in any place they've lived, partly because the church is both here but also not of here. There's a kind of there's an earthly connection, but there's also kind of a heavenly reality that it's connected to.
Yeah.
And there is, there's this image comes to mind, and it's kind of a digression, but we did an episode, Caravaggio's painting of Lazarus.
Yeah.
Lazarus is being raised from the dead, and he's the way he's portrayed is kind of in a cruciform, one arm up, one arm down, one towards the earth and one towards heaven. And I've always thought that's kind of the Christian tension generally. He's kind of reaching, he kind of wants to reach for the skull, the earth, death, downward, but he also wants to kind of reach up all the time. And so we kind of, as Christians, live in this, especially Catholics, live in this kind of drama constantly. And we're asked to kind of infuse the social and the political order and the culture, but we're also also asked to pull ourselves away from it. 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out the door. And there's this kind of, it's an interesting thing that the Christian living amidst our growing pluralistic culture, but I think that's always kind of been the case maybe with the church.
Yeah, but you mentioned the drama aspect, and I want to mention that because I think I've just got through teaching some John Henry Newman in the late 19th century church history. He was very big on talking in some areas about Christian imagination, and I think knowing the drama of salvation history and being able to overlay that image of history on the material and political history around you is part of what Christians have to do in general, to never lose sight of the fact that you're part of a universal drama. You're in this thing, which is part of the whole function of salvation, not just your own salvation, but salvation of others in the world. And that's the function of operating. You kind of have to have a double vision about your own place in things. So that Christian imagination, Bishop Barron often talks about this, that you have to have a sense of yourself in the drama in order to feel any urgency about what it is you're trying to do, because the culture itself will not necessarily reward you for devotional practices or for virtues themselves or anything like that. So it's really up to you to find the places where you feel that urgency to pursue those goals and to do those things. And I wonder, even if for young men it's not the full boat of Catholic drama and action that they're thinking of what it would be like to be activated by a sure knowledge of where you are and what you're meant to do. And that, as we work in seminary all the time to at various stages to come to certainty about what you're called to do and then prepare you to do it. And in a way, that's such a straightforward education.
It's super liberating.
It is. Well, and I think in that sense, we're receiving a classically liberal education. I mean, that's what that means, right? To be set free, to be able to encounter the universal, to meet the universal truths of life, to meet truth, to meet the person of truth, who is Jesus Christ. But you're right. It's relatively straightforward in conception.
Right.
In the mind.
Doesn't mean it's easy.
Exactly, because you're dealing with humans, right? And if it was just about kind of water hose effects, open the water hose and give them truth and let them go home, that would be easy. That's not the point. Is that we're forming men, forming human beings, and as future priest, you as a father of your own family have a particular role of how we form others, given this tradition we've been given, given this life, this wisdom that kind of in its embryonic forms was founded in Rome and then kind of developed into the Christian living, and then Jesus Christ revealed to us what truth is and who truth is, and then kind of now we're in 2023 have this podcast, and somehow we have to draw people into this encounter with the divine, with the logos.
Yeah. So really, you mentioned the liberal arts before, and it is another answer to the question you asked before, which is what was good in Rome, and how did the church change it? And we talk about this in the college, especially. We have a liberal arts college. That's what the church recommends as a preparation for priestly discernment. And that's a Roman structure. That's in the Roman schools.
Seminaries, if I'm not mistaken, are seminary or are Roman structure too.
Generally. Yeah, as a school structure, they're similar. But what you get from the classical period is this 7 liberal arts meant, as you say, to foster freedom in the person and then to give you knowledge of the world. What the church adds to that, we accept that framework out of the classical world wholeheartedly. It comes into the monastic schools. It comes into the cathedral schools. Eventually, when universities are born in the Christian Middle Ages, we add the study of philosophy, also with a lot of classical background. But the 7 liberal arts are then considered the preparation for philosophy. And then the language of philosophy is that she is the handmaiden to theology. And that's where the explicitly Christian content comes through. So it's the fulfillment, if you will, of the structure of the 7 liberal arts over a course of time and in the Christian tradition, which is part of that adaptation of Romanness that comes into the modern era.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think just to listen to what you guys have been talking about for the last couple minutes, you mentioned this imaginative vision of reality. I think as Christians now living in America in 2023, kind of given what we've been talking about, we need to immerse ourselves in Scripture, in our own story, so that we know where we stand within that drama. And then that can become, as you mentioned, Doctor, the lens through which we view the world in which we live now. And what that will allow us to do, hopefully, is, what St. Martin did, hopefully embody the virtues, the good virtues of the culture in which we live, of which there are some, even though it's not all great.
Sure.
And then elevate them, redeem them. Like the church elevated the liberal arts, like Martin elevated the Roman virtues. We can hopefully find what's good in the world that we're in the midst of, and through Christ, bring that to its full potential.
This is a Christian way to sanctify the ordinary in Jesus Christ, through grace, through our living. I mean, this is, I think, distinguished from the Roman way. This Jesus Christ helps us sanctify the world, not just doing it for political gain, not just doing it for some sort of social climbing, but for holiness. It's a different purpose in life that guides the Christian living.
Now, you use the word elevating, which I really like. But my question, I guess, to the two of you is, you've taken a modern format. Obviously, you're doing podcasts, and you're trying to bring that into, coordination with your own education and the tradition of the church here. Are there other examples, like when you think of yourselves at the beginning of seminary, let's say in high school, maybe among that Tik-Tok group that, are thinking of the Roman Empire, are there places or practical things that you can think of that are part of, let's say, a settled tradition or part of something reliable where you could imagine a young man at that stage picking up and elevating what he has somehow?
From our current culture?
Yeah, from the current culture.
That's a great question.
Yeah. I think there is something to First of all, I'd like to point out that suddenly he became the interviewer, and now we're answering questions. This is interesting. The tables have turned.
Well done. Not falling for your trick.
Okay, there will be no answer.
But in my own upbringing, just kind of playing sports, but then also the sense I've got of the American dream of kind of hard work, achievement, merit. There's a Pelagian way that can be lived out, where we think that we have to be self-sufficient and completely independent and autonomous, and I
Save
think
ourselves.
That can be destructive. But I think if understood in union with grace, like the reality of grace, then this idea of being able to go from rags to riches, like God does want to transform us from sinners to saints, and the drive of the American spirit that I kind of have imbibed throughout, like that I've perceived throughout my life, I think is, I think it's legitimate, if that makes sense.
So a healthy drive, but you have to be careful about how it goes.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And on a practical basis, I'm now thinking about like my former like soccer workouts.
Yeah,
I know this is maybe too ordinary, but like this is something that I remember as a young man. Like I would go to mass, and you'd hear the priest talk about this, like make sure try to be holy in everything that you do and all that stuff. And I would always like come to me like, what are the guys talking about? I'm not going to talk about that. What are they saying? Well, let's not go there. In my mind, I was like, maybe this is one way I could try to stick out a little bit, because I am Catholic, and I do try to live my Christian faith, and I was raised better than that. I think I've since then gone downhill, but there's a sense
now
of
you should hear Max when he plays soccer. It's
English and Spanish cuss words. No, but there is a sense in where like little things like that I know have helped me, but it does become difficult because most high schoolers now have iPads and iPhones, and they don't have, I think, unfortunately, a lot of teachers that do care about them or invest in them. The arts, the liberal arts are almost a joke in your public school system. People don't take, music appreciation. It's playing a little flute,
Hey, man.
And Mary has a little lamb, Joey excelled in that class, obviously.
I could play Mary had a little
I'm
fifth
sure
grade
you could.
recorder.
Yeah, I'm sure you could. A little recorder, and it's like, that's fine, but like, is that art? Well, that's the expression we get. How am I supposed to sanctify that? How is this dignified? Or acting, for example, theater. It was always interesting in my high school because we had a really good theater professor, and so he would always draw in both the kind of the jocks, but also like the nerds, and there was like an interesting complementarity between them, and that was a beautiful thing.
It's a tough thing to do.
It's a very tough thing to do, but even then, it was like maybe that's a way you help elevate something into through the Christian identity, through grace, recognizing that these are other ways you can maybe live that out. I don't know. These are some things that come to mind.
I think those are good examples. Yeah.
Doctor, we could talk for a long time. This has been so enjoyable. I'm sure, there's so much more to say about Rome, the Roman Republic, Roman Empire. But for our listeners' sake, for your sake, we'll let you go. Thank you so much for
Thank you guys
Doctor,
for having me.
For coming on.
It's a lot of fun to do this.
It's been really cool.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Keep thinking about Rome, whatever it is.
Yeah. Keep and maybe read about it too and study it.
Sure.
I don't have anything else to say. Do you?
No, just if you're still listening and you're checking this podcast out, consider liking and subscribing to our platform. We're on YouTube and so many other places. Thank you all for your perseverance in these episodes. Our listeners have gone up, and I don't know, I'm inspired by that. I'll look up, I'm like, man, we are getting a lot more listeners, and it's kind of, I don't know, I rejoice in that. So thank you all. Thank you again, Doctor, for your time, and thank you for teaching us too outside of just this platform. Thank you for. I always look forward to talking to you.
It's my pleasure, really.
Thank you. So, guys, Dr. Graff, thank you for coming on, and we thank you all for tuning in. And as always, God bless.